Hello, everyone, and welcome to Wolfed, a podcast for engineering leaders and for those aspiring to deliver products and outcomes that matter. I'm your host, Christopher Cohen, and today I'm super excited to speak with Rasmus Ekman, that is the Vice President of Cloud Engineering at Oracle, about his experiences leading teams across Japanese, European, and American cultures. So in today's episode, Rasmus will talk with us about his career journey from starting abroad in Japan to joining major US companies like IBM, Microsoft, and of course, Oracle. And we'll also cover how he found his way to engineering from a pretty non-traditional background of mathematics and Japanese linguistics. We'll then get his take on why curiosity is a key value for today's aspiring engineering leaders who want to stay sharp. And we'll close out the conversation by diving into the role customer feedback should play when developing for a new product. Rasmus not only has an impressive international background, but he's also very down to earth, and he offers really practical advice for up-and-coming engineering leaders. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming today's guest. Today, we're thrilled to introduce a visionary leader who has pioneered transformative strategies across some of the tech industry's most prominent players, including IBM, Microsoft, and most recently in his current role as Vice President of Cloud Engineering at Oracle. He's a world traveler who spent the early part of his engineering career in Japan and has left an indelible mark on the technology landscape. Please welcome Rasmus Ekman to the podcast. Welcome, Rasmus.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me.
Let's start with what was your exposure? What got you interested in software engineering, just to start with?
So, fortunate enough to have had computers around, all my life, in essence. Like growing up, being European, I started with Amigas at a very young age. Right, like first owned computer was like an Amiga 500, but my dad had computers for work. Right, like he ran his own company, so like he had a 286 at home to do bookkeeping, and computers everywhere all the time. Right. So just tinkering with computers from like a very young age is really how it all started. And so much like most other people, right, started with BASIC and Hobgoblin together, go-to statements and whatnot. And that's kind of how I got into the computer track in general. So I wouldn't call that software engineering, right? But
Not
in
yet.
terms of dealing with computers and always being into tech, it started very, very early, just from exposure and interest, to be honest, right?
So what was the moment where it kind of became something more than just, hey, I kind of fiddle around with this stuff, it's interesting to me? When did it strike you like, hey, this might be what I do with my life?
That actually never happened. So it's kind of a false premise question. So I've actually tried to avoid software engineering and IT in general as my career track. So I have a pretty useless background in terms of my education if you wanted to go into like a computer science type route. So I actually tried to avoid it. I did statistics and econometrics, so mathematics and Japanese linguistics as a double major, which is probably the worst combination you can imagine if you ever want to be employed somewhere. And I tried to go into finance. So I actually tried to avoid IT. I'd done a lot of internships. So I actually interned while going to college in Japan, interned at an IT company. Mostly because I'm good at it. It's self-taught and just knew my way around it. So I got internships and part-time work to kind of cover for my studies. And I said, I don't ever want to do that again. Like, that's not what I want to do. It's not where I want to be. I want to go like I want to be a finance bro is kind of where I wanted to be. And I would say it was my interest for technology, and let's say my interest was probably honestly a lot more with technology more than it ever was with finance in reality. And going through the recruitment process in Japan when you graduate at college, like everybody goes to apply for work at the same time. It's an interesting experience in and of itself. But I applied for a lot of finance places, and the IT companies are like, no, you should come and look at us. You should look at this. And I I was trying to push myself into finance, and the IT companies were trying to pull me into, their stuff. And at the end of the day, it was just better offers. It sounded more interesting. And it's like, I guess. And I kind of boomerang back from having said, I'm never going to do it. And I went back into it, even with kind of an unconventional background. So that's the long story of like, no, I never chose the engineering route. It chose me.
Yeah, I was gonna say. Did you go to college in Japan?
I did. So I went. So I'm. If I don't look Japanese, I'm not. I went to college both in Sweden and in Japan. So I was back and forth on exchange programs. But I went to both a Japanese college and a Swedish college. So tried to stay in Japan.
So was it just that, like, as you were graduating, like you said, like all of the students were kind of applying all at the same time, and it was these Japanese companies these IT companies that were reaching out to you, trying to get you to work for them?
Yeah. So I mean, at this point, I had my double major. I've studied classical Japanese, which means I translate from very, very old archaic Japanese to modern Japanese. Again, a very useless degree to have. But I was like, now that I have it, why don't I try to see if I can get a job in Japan? If I can't, I guess I'm off to just getting a PhD, or I don't know. It was one of those, let's see what happens kind of thing, which I think has been a common theme throughout my career, to be honest. It's very much go with the flow and what's interesting, and, when the right opportunity arises. So yeah, I just tried to see what can I get in Japan now that I'm fluent in Japanese, and take it from there.
That's amazing. And for what it's worth, you're in good company. We've heard that a lot on this podcast. So you're certainly not alone there. Okay. So now we're kind of working at, I guess, IC roles in Japan.
Yep.
What did this rise to, your first leadership position look like?
I mean, like everybody else, you start as an IC, right? So I started with a lot of implementation and consulting type work, right, in tech, but very business apps focused, right? So you can imagine like your ERP type systems and supply chain management applications. Leveraged a lot of my statistics backgrounds because I did statistics software as well, right? Like implementing, statistical models, et cetera, et cetera. And it just wasn't really where I wanted to be, in the sense of it wasn't what was the most interesting to me within like the larger tech scene. I'm probably much more of a, let's say, an infrastructure / platforms person at the end of the day, right? If we split up tech into, let's say, apps versus tech, I'm probably a lot more on the tech side of things. So as AWS was getting started in Japan, I got a tap on the shoulder. It's like, hey, I know you from, we used to work together. So the first company I ever worked for was Oracle. One of the first people at AWS Japan he came from Oracle, and he's like, I know what you're doing and what you can do. Like, you should come on over. This is probably your thing. And I was like, yes, like that is very much my thing. So the second company I ever worked for was AWS, where I started to do a lot more kind of virtual team lead type things, right? As you ease into management and more senior leadership type positions, like that was kind of my first foray into, you just build things on your own, and you help grow teams, even if you're not a people manager. So I did that for a couple of years, and then I went into IBM. So a lot of people raised a lot of eyebrows, like, why would you go from AWS to IBM? But I went into quite a bit more senior role with, quite a lot headcount, and, just like management focused to a large degree. So that was kind of the first place where it's like applied everything I got from AWS and I knew from Oracle, and with the idea of leading up their cloud group, in essence, in Japan. So I became the cloud CTO, or CTO for cloud, which you can think of as a field CTO type position.
Sure.
But the entire team that would that would do that, right? So you can imagine like advisors that go out to like CIOs, CTOs, that type of thing, right? But that was kind of the first real management position for me.
So something that I'm really curious about started gaining a lot more experience being a manager in Japan, and now, of course, more recently, you've got experience being an engineering leader in America. Like, Japan is a culture that often prioritizes academic background, university pedigree.
Yep.
Have you seen tangible differences in like how this approach impacts diversity within engineering teams, innovation within teams? What did that look like culturally?
There's a lot of differences, right? There's a lot of differences, which I find exciting, right? So, just straight out of school, how Japanese companies end up picking candidates is wildly different from how it would work in the US or Europe for that matter. For better or worse, they look a lot more at which school did you graduate from and what degree you got doesn't matter as much, because there is this idea that if you got into a difficult school, you had to study really hard and you know how to study hard and how to learn things. So you're never going to have the right knowledge anyway to do the work that you need to do. And you're going to be new. You're going to be like a new grad. Like you're not going to know anything anyway. So we might as well hire the people that know how to learn things. And their selection criteria in essence becomes like the nicer grade of a school we can pick people from, the better off we'll probably be. And then we're going to train these people, right, to do whatever they need to do. So in a way, I don't think I would ever be on my current career track because I have probably a very unusual academic background, where normally you would see people with computer science degrees, et cetera, and if you don't have one, you don't go on the track that I did. So I was fortunate enough to get picked because of pedigree from school, right? To then get taught, in essence, what I needed to know to do the job the right way. So I really do appreciate the Japanese way because I think they get a lot more diverse candidates. It obviously takes more effort and investment to train these people to do it the right thing. So there's the idea that people will stick around for longer, which can also be a good and a bad thing. It's just a very different landscape, right? But I personally lucked out. I'm super happy with where I am today and like how things turned out. It was the perfect thing for me, but it probably wouldn't have happened if I went the normal route and just applied to like an IT company in Sweden or the US, for example, with the background that I had.
Yeah, at first rub, it's so interesting to me because that approach sounds like you might end up with, if we're really only prioritizing like what university did these candidates come from, it sounds like you could end up with like a very uniform set of individuals. And yet, because there's not as much of an emphasis on what you studied, as you've yourself have pointed out with your degrees, almost that's actually thrown away because, well, no, we do have this very diverse set of people who come from all different kinds of areas of learning. I wonder what you think about the trade-off there versus, a culture maybe like the US, which isn't necessarily as concerned with university, which university you're at, but maybe is more inclined to focus on computer science background, stuff like that. What do you think?
I mean, there's pros and cons to each method, right? Obviously. And I'm not going to say I feel like Japan is on the forefront in the general tech scene, right? If we think of a global perspective, obviously the US is ahead. So there's something to be said for results. And it's also why I asked to be relocated to the US, right, from Japan, even though I'd worked there for a very long time. Obviously, I think you can get more highly skilled people with very specific specialist knowledge much faster with, let's say, the US approach of things. And you will always be limited if you don't do it that way in terms of like how far and how quickly you can move it. The nice thing about the Japanese approach, right, is that I do think it creates a little bit more diverse thinking in certain groups. There is the idea that you should be moving people around within the company into wildly different roles, right? So like as you try to groom people for senior management or senior leadership positions within the company, the idea is that they should know all the different parts of the business. So they should have worked over in this department for a couple of years, over this department for a couple of years. I do think there's a better sense of understanding the business and the company all up this way. But you also dilute the idea of being able to focus and do a certain task like very well, right? So there is a trade-off, and I don't think it's an either or. Personally, I do think you can look at both aspects and benefit from both of them, right? Like not everybody should go on one track or the other. Like some people probably should be treated one way, and you can probably mix and match is probably what I would see as the ideal way of doing this. So it's definitely not a binary discussion in mind.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, ultimately, do you feel that you noticed a major difference in the Japanese teams you were managing versus the American teams when it comes to diversity of thought, diversity of expertise in these kinds of environments?
100%. So, and this, I mean, is more than just like Japan versus the US. So I managed global teams for many years where we had employees all over the world like report into me. So it's, you would have Europe and Southeast Asia and North America and Japan. And, you have the cultural differences as kind of like a base layer. And then you add the individual aspects, right? Like the personalities on top of it. So it is very, very obvious that there are some big broad stroke differences. So in Japan, for example, there's a lot more, I don't even know what to call it. It's not very explicit, right? Like there's a lot of things that are implicit and you should just read the room, or they say you should read the air in Japanese. So not saying something is the same as saying something. And there's a lot of miscommunications, I would say, where, the Japanese teams would think that's like everybody else should understand what we're saying. Like you don't say it, but like they know, right?
Yeah.
While in the US, it needs to be a lot more explicit and outspoken. And I think that might be a function of it being a more diverse culture to begin with, right? Like when you have a bigger mix of people, like to not get the same type of confusion, you just need to be a lot more direct. And, that doesn't gel with, how things work in Japan a lot of the time. But all of these teams were very, very different. And if you've never experienced it, it's very difficult to manage as well. I would say like a European who has lived a very long time in Japan and now in the US, et cetera, is like you start to experience all of these things. And until and unless you have, it's very difficult, I think, to manage international teams effectively, right? Which I think is becoming a more and more important quality in general.
So you would credit then a lot of your success, leading cross-cultural collaboration across all, such a diverse team, certainly in part, if not in full, to this background that you have, huh?
I think it has helped me a lot. You can definitely do it without that background, obviously. I just think it will take you a lot longer to gain the same experience, right? So in a way, it's been like a crash course. And also, I would say a head start where a lot of people would start to build up this skill once they're, 10, 15 years into their career, right? Where they start to do a lot more international work and work on bigger things and managing bigger teams with more diversity and more cultural backgrounds. If you can get a head start, it definitely helps. So for me, and this is how I got to the US as well, it was because I was, if I may say so myself, but performance reviews and whatnot, I managed the international teams very, very well, right? Compared to many of my peers. And they were like, no, we should put the international team under Rasmus because it just works, right?
Wow.
So, and that, helps accelerate things even further. But yes, I don't think I would have been where I'm at today if that wouldn't have been the case. Right?
That's amazing. So, and you mentioned a little bit ago that you did ask to be relocated at some point from Japan to the U.S. So, what was the main impetus behind that ask or that transition?
So this is, I mean, working in the tech industry, right? So I'd only ever worked in Japan, right? But if you look at the companies I worked for, so you have Oracle, IBM, Amazon, Microsoft, right? Like, okay, like
We're seeing a pattern.
there is a certain pattern to this, right? Where if you're working for the top companies in our industry in general, like many of them or most of them will be US companies. And I just wanted to be on the forefront in terms of the type of technology that I worked on. Japan tends to lag behind. It's just a matter, is it like 1 year? Is it 3 years? Is it 5 years? It depends a little bit on the technology, but it is always lagging to a certain degree. Where Japan is more about adoption of technology as opposed to inventing and creating to a large degree. Not saying that's the case everywhere all the time, but as a general trend. So I wanted to work a lot more closely with my US colleagues. I wanted to work on bigger things, and a lot of the big things tended to be North American things, right? With the type of work that we did. So I asked my boss, it's like, hey, can we come up with a long-term plan to get me relocated to the US, right? I'm working on international stuff already. So can we figure out how I get there? And this was probably the first and only time I've ever been a little bit, I had some forethought into the general direction of my career and what I wanted to do. But it was one more challenge. It's like, yes, I've done Japan for a long time. I would really like to try to go to the US before I'm completely stuck, so to speak.
Gotcha.
You know.
You've mentioned some of these really major companies that you've worked for, and before we were recording and we were talking about like some of the differences between how, let's say, Microsoft versus Oracle handles the role of engineering leaders. I think I'm particularly interested in this idea of like, as an engineering leader, what is the value in being purely a people leader versus being, somewhat still a hands-on contributor who's also an engineering manager? I think you said that, this varies pretty significantly culture to culture at each organization. So I'm wondering from you, like, where do you fall in which of these approaches is either, I mean, I don't want to say better because I'm sure there's pros and cons, but I guess that would be the better question. Like, what do these pros and cons look like for each of these approaches in your estimation?
And I do want to preface, I want to have my safe harbor statement and say it's like, hey, my experiences are my own, and like my experience is not a reflection of the entire company, et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely.
But what I saw was, and I do praise Microsoft for this, to be honest, right? So like I was a senior director there for 5+ years, right? And the amount of training and focus that I got in terms of people management, as opposed to the engineering aspect of things, was really, really good and helped me grow as a manager as well and be a bit more people focused. So there is something to be said for the Microsoft, I would call it the Microsoft approach, but they have a tendency to have managers that wouldn't necessarily be able to do the job of an IC, right? But they can be phenomenal people. So that's in stark contrast to what I've experienced in my current organization or in Oracle, where it's very much the technical rock stars are the ones that get bubbled up and become managers. And 50% of my work today is IC like work, and 50% is let's call it leadership type things that you need to do to maintain and run the organization. But the expectation is that you should be able to go in and work on like the most important project and be very hands-on, really know what you're doing, more so many times than the bulk of the ICs that you would have in your organization. I would say the opposite is probably true for Microsoft. And I wouldn't call either one better. There's pros and cons to both. Uh, how I look at it would be they cater to different type of people. So I would think one model is better for a certain group of people, and the other model is better for a different group of people. And I think we kind of gravitate to the one we like the most, as in that's where you're going to be the best, right? So for me personally, I love getting hands on with customers or working on like big projects, learning new things all the time, right? I don't want to be the person who's just like, hey, my whole job is to do one-on-ones with my direct reports, and it's like, how are you doing? How can I help you? How can I unblock it? And it's like it could have been any industry, right? Like it doesn't matter what industry they work on or what actual work they do day to day. It's very, fuzzy in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
I like to be very direct and hands-on myself. So for me personally, I love the current feel for the organization, or let's call it culture, like company culture. It's just a very philosophically different approach, and I think it comes from top leadership down. Right? It is a cultural difference.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wonder if in your personal experience, as you were growing through your roles and you were looking at your own managers, did you find that you were more profoundly affected by managers that were primarily people leaders versus managers that were more hands-on? And observing that, did that affect how you approach it today?
Definitely. I mean, it's kind of tricky. So like that's why I say like neither one is necessarily better than the other. Some of the best managers I've ever had have been, let's say, more people focused managers, just because that works really well with me. But I like to be very hands on myself, right? So like I do think there's something to be said for, the combination of you and your manager as well. So not everybody's going to fit into the same mold. I try to pick up the best out of all the different aspects I've seen myself, and do a mix of all of it. Because I'll say I learned some fantastic things at Amazon, for example. Like I still apply a lot of what I learned there, and what I remember as an IC, right? It's like I really like that way or this way of doing things. And I try to apply it throughout all the different roles, for example. Same is true for Microsoft, right? I feel like I picked up a lot of the, let's say, the focus on diversity and teams. That can be culture, that can be, diversity in many different ways, but the importance of that, and, focusing on things like career development for your reports, for example, I think is hugely important. But I tried to pick up all the things that I've liked, and there are many things I didn't like, but I tried to keep all the positive things throughout. And, I think that's how it goes. Like you learn and you grow, and that's why it's important that you get many different experiences in your career, right? The more different things you see, the more you can kind of form your own point of view and what you think the right style is.
And I imagine some of the cons of each of these approaches are, maybe as people leaders, primarily we might lose sight of the day to day and might lose sight of, being quote unquote in the weeds versus being too hands on. We might lose sight of bigger company goals and the outcomes we're trying to drive. I mean, would you agree that these are the pitfalls that we're trying to avoid, and ultimately we got to strike a balance?
Definitely. And I think it also depends a lot on the type of people you have. I think my approach would be very different depending on the type of people that were in the team, right? So it's not a one size fits all either. I would say, especially in engineering organizations, there is something to be said for gaining the trust of the team in the sense of knowing what you're talking about. I mean, I think very few people in engineering like to work for somebody who you feel doesn't know what they are talking about, or understand the real work that's happening, right? So there is something to be said for, leading by doing, especially in engineering organizations, and having that be a way to build up trust. And with trust comes a lot of other good things, right? So I don't know. The engineer in me wants to say just it depends to all the questions. Like it depends. Depends.
I wonder if you feel that there's a certain rung of leadership, or like a level of leadership where we say like, we need hands-on experience. We need, former engineers who have hands-on tech background, maybe as a director, maybe as a VPE, but maybe do we say like, hey, as a CTO, the vision gets so broad and the things that we're dealing with are so high level that maybe all we do need is great business acumen and of course some fluency in tech, but the fact that we haven't had hands-on keyboard isn't as important, or vice versa, or what do you think?
It's a tricky question. I obviously have my own personal preference. I find it very difficult to see how you would have a great CTO who wouldn't want to be very hands-on. Maybe they don't have the time to be hands-on always, but there is something to be said for having the person that has the desire and the right level of curiosity, right? Because our field evolves so very quickly that if you're not curious and genuinely interested in what we do at a technical level, I don't think you can be the best type of CTO that you could be, right? So one thing, I mean, and I picked this up from Werner Vogel's, right? So AWS, like CTO, and which stuck with me for a long time. So we were doing interviews when he was in Japan, and he talked about this very problem. And he was like, "I have one full day every week, like full day just blocked. Like nobody can get to me. It's like headphones on. I'm either reading books that I put on my list on like new technologies that I'm, have been interested in or heard customers mention a lot that I don't know well enough. Or it's just like, hey, I need to just sit down for a couple hours and code just for the sake of doing it." Uh, would you call those, critical company mission critical objectives? No, right? But do I think he's one of the most effective CTO type people we have in the industry? Like, yes. So the fact that he wants to learn and wants to keep his skills sharp, I think that is the indicator in my mind. And that's why I would be happy to work for such a person, right? But if you have somebody who's like, no, it's we need to hit the company objectives, but like I actually have no idea like this latest generation of technology because like where's the business value? I would kind of scratch my head a little bit personally, although I know these people exist a whole lot, but maybe it's a personal preference, right? Like it's not like I've run data and the statistician in me wants to say it's like, all right, let's test the theory, right? And see where it leads. But no, I do think curiosity is a must, and wanting to be hands on keyboard, researching new technologies. It's something I do myself quite a lot, which is why I like to be hands on and talk a lot to customers directly. Because the second I hear a new company name or a new technology, the fact that it came up in conversation with a customer, it probably means that they're thinking about it a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that I don't know about something that they are thinking about a lot, that piques my interest, right? So
Yeah.
I kind of make a mental note on the spot, and later on I go and look it up and I read their documentation and I see what's going on or what other people are saying. Should I learn more about this? You can think of this as ADD like leadership style, maybe, where it's just whatever I hear, I kind of go and do. But I try to make very quick judgments on like, okay, I know why they said it. Not that interesting to me. Cool, let's move on. It's like, hey, this one I've heard 3 times this week. I should probably pay attention and go and look up what it's about. And that's where you get to the Werner aspect of things. That's like, I need to have my time to be able to do it. And I think if you don't set aside that time, you will lose your edge in this industry.
You've mentioned that you talk to customers a lot. You go out of your way to be very customer facing in that regard. And it makes me, something that I haven't heard a lot from engineering leaders on this podcast is the role of customer success as an engineering leader. It sounds like that's really important to you. I wonder if you think broadly that's a tenet that really should apply across the board for engineering leaders, or is it just in your position specifically that it makes sense at Oracle, or what do you think?
I hate to use the word always, but my mind kind of gravitates towards yes, always. And I think it's a big pitfall that I see quite often in engineering, where there's this antagonistic view between customers or users and engineering, as in the idea that like users are stupid, etc. I really don't think so. As in, it's, everybody's trying to achieve something, everybody's trying to make their life or work easier. We're all trying to do more. So, going and talking and understanding more the points of view of your users or your customers, whoever it may be, like the people that apply the technology that you're providing in some shape or capacity. If you don't, I don't know what you're doing. You can be visionary, and it's like, hey, if you went and talked to the customers that were on a horse and buggy, right, like they just wanted a bigger, faster horse kind of thing, you would have never invented the car. I get that, but if you don't listen to it, like, you can make your own interpretation after the fact on like what the best way would be to address what they're saying.
Mm-hmm.
But to not listen to them is not the solution, to use a double negative. Right. So I think it's hugely important.
That makes a ton of sense. And I mean, it's a classic customer success tenet that, like, we want to hear the pain points. You want to dig in and understand the problem statement. And then maybe the solution doesn't look like what the customer thought it looked like, but we can still, get there one way or another. I wonder where you think, the proverbial buck stops in this regard, where, like, do you promote even your ICs to be customer facing and to be hearing this stuff, and how high up should this idea go, where, like, customer success should be org wide? We should all be pitching in to understand what the pain points are, what the gaps are.
It's a sliding scale, right? It depends. It also depends on the type of engineering that you do, right? So I tend to sit in what would be considered like customer facing type engineering. So what we do is a lot of customer success like things, adoption things, architecture for large customer systems, etc. So, like, by the very nature, like, we have to be customer facing down to IC level. Not necessarily true for all kinds of engineering organizations, right? Obviously, I would encourage it and say it should be done much more frequently than it is currently. To tie back to the Japan track a little bit, they have this idea that you should send people off and do different type of work for like a year and whatnot, and then come back. We had the same type of thinking in Microsoft, where it was very corporate functions versus field functions. So you would have corporate engineering versus field engineering. I think it's very, very healthy, even if you don't have, let's call it, corp engineers out talking to customers all day long, because it's not what they're supposed to do. But having them do like a 6-month stint in like a field engineering team, for example, I think helps tremendously with cross-pollinating ideas and infusing that thinking that at the end of the day, there is an end customer somewhere for everything that we do, and to have more of a customer understanding and maybe empathy at the end of the day. So not for everybody every day, all day long,
Sure.
but it's like, hey, maybe you do it for that guy who's been working like on internal systems for like 5 years straight. Maybe you put him in more of a customer facing engineering type role for 6 months, and maybe they love it. Maybe they don't, and they come back. Who knows? But I do think it would be beneficial to do so for a lot more engineering leaders than I see currently.
That makes a total sense to me, especially because I found in my experience that the stereotype of the engineer who's secluded in a dark room and not never talking to anybody doesn't generally exist that often. Like most engineers that I've worked with have plenty of capacity to be customer facing and really honestly I think enjoy that kind of work more often than one might assume.
Yeah.
So it sounds like at least holistically, that is a culture that you'd like to promote and that you think really should be targeted more often by more orgs.
I think in general, I mean, this is not even an engineering discussion in my mind. This is more of an empathy, understanding, curiosity type discussions. Like, how can you foster a corporate culture that encourages people to go out and learn new things and have new perspectives? I think that will ultimately help business objectives at the end of the day. So you can encourage that many different ways, but kind of forcing people to go out and understand different points of views by, let's say, talking to customers is very helpful. Sometimes it's enough to do it just between different teams, right? Like different internal teams. It's like, hey, and I see a lot when we have platform engineering type teams, because you tend to silo them to some degree, right? Like you have core components and then you have service teams that build upon the core components. And it's a lot of like, hey, the idiots down in core components, like put these restrictions and they don't know what they're doing. And, so there's sometimes it's, a big step to just cross pollinate a lot more between internal teams to create like a deeper understanding of like people are doing things for certain reasons, and maybe we should go and talk to them and understand why.
I love that, and I appreciate the broadening of the scope of that to beyond just engineering, because you're absolutely right. It's something, a tenet that should be adopted everywhere, right? Not just siloed to this conversation or this vertical, if you will. Well, awesome. I want to zoom out a little bit and just get a couple of your thoughts on maybe more what I'd call rapid fire questions. So one thing that I like to ask folks is, what's one piece of advice you wish you had received earlier in your career?
Probably would be more confident. I mean, most people probably to some degree suffer from imposter syndrome, right? So it's like I had this idea, it's like I don't have the traditional background, and Japan itself is very hierarchical, right? So it's the idea of respecting people who've been in the company for a longer period of time, like you kind of just have to fall in line, etc. So it took me probably way too long to have enough confidence in my own opinions, where like I know that I'm right more often than not, and pair that with most people don't know what they're doing. So maybe you should stand firm on your own opinion and maybe share it more often or frequently and not hold back. So to me, I think just confidence in my own opinion and discussing that with others would have helped me earlier on, right? I feel happy that I ended up in the right place, but it probably took me 5 more years than it should have.
I like that you frame that too, in the sense of like confidence to share your opinion and to stand by it and to engage in a conversation around it, as opposed to just like, it's not that we're talking about steamrolling anybody or just saying like I'm right, you're wrong, but just that you feel that confidence to trust in your instincts and to have an honest dialogue about it. I think that's beautiful for sure. How about a personal habit, a personal routine, something that you do that you think has contributed to your success as a leader?
This might be a little bit redundant with what we talked about earlier, but I would say curiosity as like a big topic, and that boils down into asking a lot of questions. So in conversations, let's say with customers, if something crops up and I don't understand why immediately, it's like why would they do it this way, or why are we talking about this thing? Because I will dig in with questions pretty quickly uh, to help my own understanding. Uh, but that curiosity has opened up a lot of new things, right? You learn a lot of new stuff that you apply elsewhere, and it helps you, I'll say, stay sharp skills wise as well. And that's probably been the main factor in my success. It's like, hey, I know what's going on. I know, like, for example, like the new frameworks that are cropping up, like that all the startups are using. I will use that in a conversation with a large enterprise that I'm talking to. It's like, hey, did you notice that these guys are doing it this way? And those small things add up quite a lot. So I would say being curious.
And being willing to ask questions. And, I think that is like, it's easy to say out loud, but I think there's a lot of inherent fear to like looking like you don't know something, or looking dumb is another way of saying it. Right. So that willingness to dig in and say, hey, I don't know about that. Will you tell me a little bit more? I mean, it's funny. You're bringing me right back to customer success again about this idea of conducting discovery. Has anyone ever told you, Rasmus, that you would have been an excellent chief customer officer?
I might have heard that once or twice. And it might not be a bad idea. Who knows?
I love that. That's so cool. Maybe a little more casual. What kind of stuff are you? What media are you consuming these days? What do you read? What do you listen to? What do you watch?
Oh, this is so much. So, well, I have a small little toddler, so it's mostly Baby Shark on repeat a thousand times in the car. And then I try to just like have my own noise canceling headphones in my office and like catch up on adult music. But the main thing I've been trying to do is actually, since I mentioned I have a small daughter, and she's, we're trying to do Japanese, Swedish, and English. So I noticed my Japanese reading had been slipping a little bit. So I've just been trying to churn down my big backlog of just Japanese fiction, any and all Japanese fiction, to just kind of like a wide range of topics, because I found myself just only reading, let's say, the news, and it becomes like very narrow in terms of the type of things you read. So a lot of Japanese, which I haven't done in a couple of years, but I was like, I'm slipping a little bit. So that would be it. Anything and everything Japanese at this point.
Gotcha. I don't think we've celebrated in this episode enough, like you being a polyglot at the end of the day. That's unbelievable, because your English is absolutely flawless. And to think that that's not even your first language, let alone one of your many languages. How many do you speak?
It depends, which should be like, that should be like the title of this podcast. Like, it depends. Because I'm Swedish, and Norwegian and Danish is so similar that I don't like to count them. So
Sure.
I just mush that into like one language, but German, English, and Japanese. So 4 or 5.
At least 4. Yeah. I wonder, I mean, so now here you are actively providing this for your daughter, in a very focused way. Was that your experience, or are you just, was it linguistics something that you were naturally interested in and pursued in your, older life?
I just enjoy languages, and I think it's the same maybe interest that would drive one towards technology as well. It's one, programming languages are very much like languages. So it's like, hey, I learned Java, so I can probably learn Python. Like, there's a lot, it's like, well, I learned English, I can probably learn Japanese. Probably a little bit more different, but once
you're not doing yourself enough credit there.
No, adding one more, it like becomes incrementally easier than it is. Like the first new one, as in the second language, is probably always the most difficult, and then the third, the fourth, the fifth becomes easier and easier, because you start to see the common patterns, and and I think a lot of it carries across, right? Like, once you have a solid foundation, it becomes a lot easier.
That's amazing. And it's so cool that you're going out of your way to do this for your daughter and make a point of raising her trilingual to start.
I spent so much time and effort learning it myself. So like, I'm just hoping to give her a head start, to be honest. So we'll see if she appreciates it, 20 years from now or not. But
fair enough. So one last question for you. How do you diffuse stress when you're all bunched up from a whole bunch of work?
I am probably an introvert that has been pushed into extrovert type work by the very nature, and I ended up somewhere in between. So I thoroughly enjoy just taking my motocross bike out by myself and just doing like full track day, just I load up the bike, I go by myself, I go until I can go no more and I'm too tired, and just head back home. And then you work a little bit on the bike and get ready for the next time you get to do it. So to me, it's like my alone time, but like I need to do something during my alone/downtime, and just happens to be motocross.
That's so cool. How long have you been riding?
Since I was 5, maybe.
Oh, wow.
Well, so my dad used to be a professional motocross racer, so I guess it wasn't much of a choice. It was like, all right, like you should do this. It's like, okay.
So you're passing languages on to your daughter. Your dad passed motocross on to you.
Exactly, and I'm glad he did. I will probably not push my daughter to do motocross. We'll see. That's still undecided.
We'll stick with the languages for now.
We'll
That
stick
sounds
with the
good.
languages for sure.
Well, that's all I got for you. Thank you so much for joining us today, Rasmus. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on, and a privilege. I look forward to watching your continued success and cheering you on from the sidelines. So thank you.
No, thank you for having me. This has been super exciting, and I look forward to listening into the other episodes.
That'll do it for us today from the Den of Wolft. Stay tuned for more inspiring conversations with fascinating engineering leaders like Rasmus. And until next time, I'm Christopher Cohen.